Good morning, everyone. Today I want to tell you a bit of a fishy story. And like all good fishing stories go, it deals with big fish. But maybe slightly differently to the individual guy's tale of a fish that didn't get away, which is maybe a little bit difficult to believe sometimes, in that the fish was this big. And you're probably looking at me thinking that's not very big, but that's just between the eyes. I couldn't get it out the water. This is based on multiple data sources that go back to 1940s and is hopefully a little bit closer to the truth. So I'm, in honesty, not really a fisherman. I think I used to be. If I look back at some of the photographs, I was often on the beach with my dad fishing, but I don't fish anymore. But I do remember some of my experiences when I was fishing. This is taken on KZN North Coast. I was a little bit older when I caught my first shad. I remember it very clearly. It was quite late in the evening, or early evening, late afternoon. My two sisters and my mum had already gone back to the caravan, and my dad said, "You got 20 minutes." And shad, if you are a fisherman, shad, when they start to run, you catch them quite quickly. So I had a bigger fit rod than that one. It was quite a lot bigger than me. And I was throwing a spinner into the surf, and I caught a shad. I was super excited, but I didn't know if it was size. So I hurtled along the beach with this fish flopping on the hook, rod in one hand, to my dad to ask if it was sized. And he said, yes, it was. So I rushed back and I carried on fishing, and I caught 3 within those 20 minutes. But the other fishermen down the beach had seen that those were where the shad were, and they had come to join me, and it got quite busy. And my last cast was not a fish, it was the toe of the fisherman next door to me. He wasn't very happy with me, and so I remember the story quite clearly, and I think for 2 reasons. One, because of the shad in 20 minutes, and the second was because of catching the fisherman's toe. You may be wondering why I'm telling you this, and that's because that's my first sort of real recollections of coastal fishing. That's what I sort of have as my baseline to compare change over time. So if we're looking at shifting baselines, or also known as sliding baselines, these refer to the way that reference points that we use against which we compare the condition of an ecosystem can change or undergo chronic, slow, and hard to notice changes. And if these are hard to notice and they're slow to change, you may, 1, start to accept change as normal, or 2, if the change has occurred before you had that baseline, you don't even know that there was something better beforehand. So in fishing, maybe when I started fishing here, that was my baseline. My dad's generation before had a different baseline, and my son Kane, if he starts fishing, he will have potentially a different baseline. I've put this on a negative line, but it can also, if you have good fishery management, can also be on a better one. So when you started fishing, it wasn't as good as what it can get. The baselines can be biological, so you can look at the size and quantity of fish that are being caught. They could be ecosystems, so different species that have been making up a catch composition. Cultural, a change in what is deemed to be normal or a big catch. And spatial, forgotten distributions. As Daniel Pauly said, we transform the world, but we don't remember it. So now, recreational fishing. There's a lot of people who recreationally fish in South Africa. There's a couple of estimates over the years showing that it has been increasing over time, perhaps probably a little bit of a slowdown. That's only coastal, that's not including inland or ski boat or offshore. And we fish for a number of different reasons. Fishing is also, recreational fishing has probably been one of the worst monitored sectors of fishing in the country, and if you compare it to commercial fishing, one of the poorly managed ones. We know that recreational fishing can have impacts. It's been documented globally. And one of the impacts that it can have first is you start to be size selective, meaning that you're taking out large species and large individuals first out of the population. And you'll see a change in your size classes before you start to detect a change in the frequency of your catch or your catch abundance. Okay, so then if you have declines, if you have long-term data looking at large fish species or large individuals within populations, you can start to track much better changes occurring within that fishery. But you don't have that monitoring data. Although there has been some monitoring done within recreational fisheries, these have generally been quite sporadic in terms of places that they've covered, so they've been quite narrow, or they've been very short in time frames. If someone catches a big fish, they generally like to show it. Okay, it's something that was seen as, I'm a good fisherman. I caught a big fish. How did they show it? Often on photographs within clubs and in newspapers. So thinking about these things, Jaco Barents, we were probably on the beach having a braai. We started to wonder whether we could use alternative historic data sources to try and answer some questions around these shifting baselines. So can we look at alternative data sources and pick up a change in ecosystem change through catch composition? Will we see any changes in the size or the frequency of fish that were caught? Has there been a change in what anglers perceive as a trophy species or what they perceive as a big fish within that species? And what are the current perceptions around keeping trophy fish? So we used a couple of different alternative sources. The first one was the George Herald and all the first early derivatives of that newspaper back from the 1940s. We went all the way back to 1940 to 2010. Including when it split into the George Herald and the Knysna Plet Herald. We kept both of those as one newspaper source. From this, we tried to only take shore angling catches, so we excluded all of the ski boat and offshore catches, and we also tried to narrow it down to only fish that were caught within the garden route, so from Witsands all the way through to Tsitsikamma, basically. A lot of the catches were reported as numbers, and then there were weights that were in pounds, so we converted pounds to kilograms through normal conversions. And if they were in lengths, then we converted the length to a weight through length-weight relationships. We then also used the Robberg Diaries, and the Robberg Diaries is a set of diaries that were kept on Robberg, which is just outside Plet. I don't know if any of you know it. It's a very beautiful area under Cape Nature Protection. Never used to be. It was open, and the Thiessen family had permission in the 30s to be able to build a little hut there. So they built a little hut, and they kept a diary there, and it was initially just a sort of abode for fishermen, and everyone was asked if they came, if they could please record their catches within this diary. So we used those. It covered the period from 1931 to 1986. There are a few issues of those diaries that have been lost, unfortunately. And then to get an idea of the current sort of views on trophy fishing, we did 2 surveys. One was an online survey, which was distributed through angling forums. And then the second was an in-person interviews with fishermen as they were fishing on the shoreline. Okay, the first thing that we sort of really had to grapple with is what's in the name. And you're talking about data or records that go back to the 1930s. Fish names have changed over time. This is just one example of 2 fish species, the white mussel cracker and the black mussel cracker. But if you have a look, depending on where you live or where you're fishing, these things have very different names. Okay, and in fact, if you're in East London, you call a white mussel cracker a white steenbras, which is today is a totally different species. So obviously, if we didn't know or can't standardize the names, then we're going to get a very different pattern to what it should actually reflect. So to look at this, we went and we got old reference books, so Smith's Sea Fishes, the old versions, and then we also looked for other old angling books like this one, which actually the first edition came out in about the 1930s. This was a great source of reference, and it's about recreational fishing, but it has included all of these different names from different areas. Okay, so some of our results, if we looked at now just an overview of how change or how reporting sort of changed within the newspapers, I'm going to refer to the newspaper as just the Herald from now on. In the 1940s, there was a regular column dedicated to reporting fishing catches. Emphasis was on numbers of fish, so it wasn't really on weights at all, or lengths, it was just numbers and species. And in 1945, you had the first Rock Angling Society formed. In the 1950s, your headlines started to change, not only with numbers of fish, but the really big fish started to come to the fore, so the 100-pounders. And you had your first photograph that was published with the catch and the angler in 1954. 1960s, Neisner fishing becomes far more prominent, and you actually had the start of trophy competitions on the Neisner estuary all the way back in the 1960s. The prominence of fishing within Neisner continued into the 70s. You actually had two columns now within the newspaper, one reporting on catches within the George sort of area, and the other one reporting on catches within the Neisner Plet side. And in 1971, the Neisner Angling Club became the largest fishing club in the country with 431 members. In 1984, we saw the first appeal by the Minister for Anglers to start to think about conserving fish stocks and to look at the impact that they could be having. And we had new regulations that came out in 1986. 1986 was also the last record of pointskop being caught from the shoreline, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. In the 1990s, you started to see color coming in. I thought it would be earlier than that. I don't know, but 1990s, it doesn't seem that long ago. Maybe I'm just older. But you had full color holiday supplements, and they were really advertising the garden route as this angling mecca. So come to the garden route, it's really good fishing. And you had an increase in species-specific competitions like the Galjoen Derby. And this was really surprising to me. So in 2000s, you only had the first articles that really became more sort of sympathetic or questioning what's happening to fish stocks. For example, in 2007, what happened to all the fish? And you only had the first record, now it probably happened before this, but it's the only first record in the newspapers of a fish being released live. I'm talking trophy fish that was caught and then released again. Happened in 2009. 2009. And that was from Neisner, and then in the George Herald, only reported it 1 year later in 2010. So then you look at the Robberg Diaries. And the Robberg Diaries, it was an absolutely fascinating read for me. It was so much more than just looking at catches of fish. Yes, it started off with a lot of just records of what was being caught and what the conditions were like and who was there. But it became much more than that. It became a real record of social events and other natural phenomena as well. So the records became more varied as the years went by. And there were some entries, I'm not going to go into them today because there's not enough time, but there were some entries that really highlighted the connection that people can have with places. Even though they've never been there before, this place really spoke to a whole range of visitors that had come there. But if you come back to the fishing side of the story, what was quite interesting here is you're seeing even within years, so this is more like the narrative side, even within years, it highlights the variability of catches within years. So for example, in 1944, there was a comment, fishing as a whole was bad. 7 galjoen of average size were caught. Okay, that's relative. Hoekarma today, the latest studies are showing that you have to fish for 100 hours and you'll catch 1 galjoen. Okay. They caught 7 of average size, and it was bad fishing day. Okay, but even within the same years, you can have comments that were, thousands of elf passing by, and there were quite a lot of these sort of comments within the diaries, and not just elf, there were also a range of different species, yellowtail, tuna, mussel crackers, pointskop. But then in the same year, you can have fishing as compared badly with what was 20 years ago. So there's someone else's baseline that has potentially shifted. The 1940s actually came out as a year, 1940s and 50s, with incredible catches. If you have a look down here, 14 days, 3 people, 1 yellowtail, 2 leervis, 4 blowers of pointskop, 6 of 35 galjoen Roman Hottentots, 10 sharks. It's incredible catches. If we looked at the proportion of successful trips, it ranged around between 70 and 80% for the first couple of decades, and then in the 70s it dropped down to around 50%, and the same in the 80s. And the diaries actually stopped in 86. Sorry. In 2003, we did some work in Plettenberg Bay, and the successful catch, or the proportion of successful trips, was around 32%. But as you get later, starting in the 1950s, there were already more and more entries that were sort of bemoaning the lack of decent fishing. And it became more consistent throughout. The proportion of no catch comments did exactly the opposite to the catch success rate. Oops. In that, over here in the 70s, when that success rate started to drop, you had an increase in the number of comments that were saying, we caught no fish, we caught no fish. And then people started to query it. The luckless trend of the past 9 days has persisted. Interestingly, the first record of blaashoppie, now blaashoppie is a puffer fish. People hate it. I think it's quite cool. But as a fisherman, you don't like it. And if it gets on your hook, there's a theory that you're not going to catch anything else because it is poisonous, and that slime gets on the hook, nothing else is going to bite that hook. You have to change your tackle. So people don't like it. But it was only recorded for the first time in 1967 within the diaries. Everything else prior to that was nice big fish, and then all of a sudden you see this blaashoppie pop up. And then the blaashoppie was actually reported from then onwards. Okay, but then more on a quantitative comparison, can we actually start to show change that had been occurring? Can we pick up compositional change over time? And in this way, we looked at it through presence absence. We also looked at it in species mean weights and the relative contribution of species in abundance. We can't just use numbers by themselves. We had to use the relative contribution. Obviously, these are voluntary records, so you've got a few biases. In particular, in the early years, people probably recorded more prominently those big catches. So if they caught smaller fish, blacktail, young brain, those sort of things, it might not have been recorded. Okay. The graph on the left, on the figure on the top left, shows the relative contribution of the top 8 ranked species. And you can immediately see there that there's something with pointscope disappearing off. Others, like Caballero, seems to maintain all the way through. If we did some MDS plots in Primo, we also did Permanova PCO plots. I've just put the MDS plots up here. You can see that the early years, 40s and 50s, sort of cluster closer together, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then the 90s and the 2000s clustering out in terms of presence and absence. And then again with your species mean weight, here you've got the 80s, 90s, and 2000s quite close together, and the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the relative species contribution is a little bit different. If we looked at the similarity analysis, so looking at what species are actually contributing to the dissimilarity between those different groups, a couple of species popped up, including pointscope, yellowtail, red steenbras, Dachauert, and Roman. So some of those you'll see again later, but in particular in the 1970s, they had a lot of yellowtail. Yellowtail is a shoaling species. It follows its prey. It's not really going to be there the whole time. So it's a kind of a catch. You're lucky if you get it. It's an incidental catch. It's not, you're not going to be going for it the whole time. Okay, and this is from the Robberg Diaries, and you can see some very similar trends immediately popping up. Here, these clustered actually even clustered more nicely, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and then you're starting to see a directional split out 70s and 80s in terms of presence absence, and again with your mean weight, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and with your species, relative species contribution. Similarly to the others, if we did the similarity analysis, looking at what species, pointscope again, red steenbras, Roman were coming up as species that were contributing to that dissimilarity, and then other species, which I should have mentioned earlier, white musclecracker and cob, which we thought would be, was not. They had very small differences between both the Herald newspaper and the Robberg Diaries. I'll come to the importance of that now. So then we decided we're going to look at individual species, those ones that have been highlighted as quite important. So the first one is pointscope. Pointscope is an endemic species. It gets very big. It's a slow-growing species, endemic to South Africa. The top right-hand graph shows the mean weight over decades from the Herald, and then also the number that were reported in the newspapers. And the bottom left shows it from the Robberg Diaries. Okay. We did Kruskal-Wallis tests just to look at the difference in means across the decades, and there was a significant difference within the Herald, and you can see it. And then a post-hoc Duns test showed that your 40s and 50s were significantly different from the 60s and 70s, and then there was only one individual, as I mentioned earlier, caught in the 80s. But you can see that graph there is a terrible graph. Okay. If we looked at Robberg, there was no significant difference in terms of the mean weight. But if you looked at the maximum size of the fish, and I didn't make this data up, there's a very clear trend of smaller fish being caught. Sorry, I keep going to push the button. Learfish, slightly different story. No significant difference in the mean weight, a decrease in the numbers. But in the Robberg Diaries, we had a significant difference in the mean weight and also a drop in the numbers. And then the dusky cob. So the dusky cob, remember, didn't contribute much to the dissimilarity between the decades. And again, it's not significantly different in both of those data sources. So if we looked at that, you can say, well, we've got actually 3 groups. This is amazing because, group 1, when I checked it just now, group 1 had disappeared. They're back again. Anyway, it would have been quite good if they were gone, because I could have said that they were species that disappeared from the records, literally. They were there in the early years, and then they disappeared, both numbers, and then the weights just plummeted off as well. Group 2, you had the odd big one that was still being recorded, so it was still coming up in the reports, but the numbers had decreased, and you can say it's probably got a baseline maintenance, in particular in size. Okay. Group 3, there were no significant trends. These fish popped up year after year or decade after decade. So there's a potential baseline maintenance. And then group 4, there was an increase in representation in the catches. So increase in abundance, and potentially this is again a shifted baseline in terms of numbers and perhaps ecologically. Grunter, for instance, were not caught or made a small proportion of catches within the Breede River prior to the mid-60s. Now they make up more than 80% of the catch. So there seems to be a shift with grunter. The last thing is then to look at what anglers thought. So most anglers actually want to catch fewer large fish than many small fish. And we showed them 3 different photographs, one with a very big fish, trophy fish, some smaller, medium-sized, and then one with a heck of a lot of fish, also quite good-sized ones. And which angler would they prefer to be, and which would motivate them more to go fishing? C was quite often seen as just a total excess. That wasn't great at all. Don't want to be that guy. That doesn't motivate me. A was seen by guys who want to catch fish, yes, catch large fish, yes. That motivates me to go fishing. I would like to catch that fish. But predominantly, most people actually thought that B was the right one because they were what was called more edible. They were edible, nice-sized fish and more sustainable. So there's no doubt that historically, if you caught a large fish, you did well, and it was actually celebrated, but it's becoming a little more controversial. But despite it being a bit more controversial, 52% of anglers that we interviewed still thought or still strongly or approved of keeping large trophy fish. What did they consider as a trophy fish? So again, as in the newspapers, dusky cob was the most common one. 60% of responses going down. Only 3 people said that punskop was a trophy species, although that made up more than 30% of catches in the 50s, 60s, okay? 40s, 50s, and 60s. But if you look at the mean weights of what they thought was a trophy fish, there's huge variation there, okay? Which potentially points to why people said it was actually good to keep to keep a trophy fish. Because if your idea of a trophy fish is only 2.7 kilograms, that's not a big deal, really. So to end off, the records from each of our sources are only a small fraction of all recreation and competitive catches made in the region at the time. This is just showing a small snapshot of it. Punskop showed both a size reduction and a disappearance from shore catches, and it was a long time ago. Dacheraat, red steenbras, and Roman also disappeared from catches, and this is likely to represent baseline shifts. But the low variation in average catches, biggest catches of the other top species may contribute to baseline maintenance. So people still reckon they see it, they think we can still get it. However, anglers' perceptions of what constitutes a trophy fish indicates there might be now a shift towards smaller sized individuals. And I think to end off here, looking at these alternative data sources has been extremely interesting, but hopefully the paper hasn't been published yet, but hopefully will be also highlighting and showing the benefit of looking at these different data sources to try and evaluate change over time. Thank you very much.